this particular show, and we'll stand still, and then we'll start over again with a second show, so that we've got everybody in place now, and et cetera. And so this won't be part one and part two, because this show will be all by itself, but it will be done by the three of you after that. So we'll go through the whole introduction and the whole thing as earlier.
Maybe we can think creatively about, this is King's 90th birthday, and a lot of celebrations are going on around the country. What relevance does the scholarship that we are doing has to what's going on in terms of this celebration? King would have been 90 yesterday, 90 years old. And what we're doing, of course, is we're involved in groundbreaking scholarship on Dr. King, because his spirituality is often ignored.
What we'll do, when we come back, we'll start off with you, Dr. Baldwin, and we'll use that as our introduction. You just speak, in reference to that, what you just spoke to, and then Dr. Anderson, you'll take it up, and then Dr. Howard, you'll sort of end it off, and then we'll be able to get out of this.
And I talk about my contribution, he talks about, because he has the first chapter in the book, and he has chapter 4, and they both have made contributions to the understanding of Dr. King's spirituality.
Yeah, now this is our 10-minute segment, right? Okay, very good. Thank you, and welcome back to the final segment of the show for today. The topic is the spiritual leadership of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., and we have as our guests this morning Doctors Baldwin, Anderson, and Howard. And of course, Dr. Baldwin, let's see if we can start off this final segment by giving you an opportunity to make some statements in reference to how the three of you worked together in terms of bringing this book forth, and you can sort of lay out some of the things that you would like for them to talk about in reference to this, so that it'll get us through this 10 minutes.
Yes, this is Dr. King's 90th birthday. Yesterday, January 15th, was his 90th birthday, and we think the book is particularly important in that regard, because what we've tried to do is to look at take a look at what we consider to be the very essence of Dr. King. I think you can't understand a person until you really understand their spirituality, the person's spirituality. And what we've tried to do is to look at Dr. King's spirituality and look at his spiritual life and how that translated into nonviolent campaigns for the movement, for human dignity, freedom, justice, etc. Dr. Anderson has talked a lot about Dr. King's understanding of the soul and his spirituality, which was central to his life. Dr. Howard has written a chapter on the Holy Spirit in Dr. King's life. I focus primarily on Dr. King's personal prayer life, which I think is very important in understanding his spirituality. He was very much into what we call personal prayer, prayer retreats, confession, all of the other elements of prayer, meditation, etc., fasting, because he considered that very important. So my focus has been primarily on his personal prayer life, his personal spirituality, and how that translated into what? His socio-political praxis. So I think we have to take all that into account when we talk about Dr. King.
Dr. Anderson.
The work I've done and continue to do, I do as a religious philosopher. I'm very interested not only in ideas, but in the power of ideas. I came to the study of King and the soul life in search of what was the motivating powers of it. I try to treat King not in a heroic way, but to understand King as a human being in a holistic way. And all too often we bracket the motivation behind and underneath and inside that keeps the person going when everything outside says, stop, give up, not worth it. I was interested in what motivates that soul life. And so my work was primarily on understanding King's spirituality as a motivating force of hope. how hope and joy were the very strong motivating structures against despair and the power of giving up. In fact, I talk about 2 episodes that was most important to me in looking at that, and one of them I weep. To this day, I weep over the souls of those children in Birmingham. But the power of that moment in King's life was the most devastating moment of his entire experience. And he had to speak to a nation about the loss of these children, these innocents. And it's at that moment that despair was so real, so deep, so human, that cynicism was easy. And yet he had to find the strength out of all of that to find a word of hope. And he put it into words of those children. Maybe these children will have something to say to the next generation. So if we look at the 90th birthday of King, we're still asking that question: how does hope, how does faith, how does love continue to project us when everything else goes against us? I think that was the lesson I learned in working on King in the soul life in terms of spirituality.
Dr. Howard, carry us out.
Yes, sir. Like Dr. Baldwin, like Dr. Anderson, I had a question of what caused King to keep going when things got tough. And one of the things that stood out to me was his kitchen vision experience. King was ready to give up. He had been under severe death threats. And one night he sat down at the table with his head in his hands and he said, I can't take it anymore. He had just got a phone call that said they were going to take his life if he didn't leave Montgomery. This was during the bus boycott. And he said at that moment he began to pray. And he said, Lord, I'm trying to do what's right. I'm trying to do your will. I need your help. I need you to help me make it through. And he said at that moment he heard an inner voice say, Martin Luther King, stand up for justice, stand up for righteousness, and lo, I will be with you always. And so in that instance, that resonated with me because coming out of a Pentecostal tradition, you know, we talk about the Holy Spirit speaking to us and God speaking to us. And I like the way when I saw what I saw in King was that he applied that to social action. He said because of the voice of the Lord, what he later describes in a later sermon, he says that was the voice of Jesus telling me to fight on. It was the voice of Jesus that caused him to stay consistent and to stay courageous even in the face of backlash and in the face of oppression. And so I was really excited to see that regarding Dr. King, because so often we think of the Holy Spirit as something that engenders privatized religion, that keeps us from acting in the community, that keeps us from social justice. But what I tried to show was that not just Martin Luther King, but in the black religious tradition, even with Harriet Tubman, with Frederick Douglass, with many others, it is actually their religious experience of the Lord, of the Holy Spirit, that kept them on the path toward justice. I mean, we have slave narratives where slaves heard from Jesus Christ to escape. They heard from Jesus to fight and to go back into ministry and to call other slaves out of slavery. So I'm just excited to see how we can broaden, in this 90th year of King's birthday, broaden this concept of the Holy Spirit to include social action as well as private sanctification.
Dr. Henderson, have you got anything else to say in reference to this? We're working around to Dr. Baldwin. We got about 3 minutes.
No, I think this is really important work, especially as we live in a time of so much despair. I think where we're looking for voices of power.
Yeah.
We're looking for powerful voices with powerful words. Where those words have enough power and energy to carry a new generation over the triumphs over the struggles they have now, and they're real. And so I turn to King once again and search for just one example, one motivation that we can extend to another generation, and perhaps that generation will find the strength also out of spirit.
He is truly a great leader. He was a great, Martin Luther King was a great leader, and I think we've all been impressed with him and encouraged by him and whatever. And
that legacy is probably more powerful today than at any time in history since his death. You know.
Yeah, I think that. Well, anyway, I think we've got about 2 minutes to go. And
I can sort of speak to that. I think what we need to say in terms of moving from here is where do we go from here? Dr. King raised that question in his last book, one of his last books. He wrote a book called The Trumpet of Conscience also. But what he was concerned about is the fact that we, as the world's people, have had the kind of scientific and technological advancements that have made the world a single neighborhood. But the question is, we have not used our spiritual genius to make the world one of brotherhood and sisterhood.
Better place.
brotherhood and sisterhood. So I think we need to go from here. Dr. King was a globalist, and often he's not understood in those terms. He said in his book, The Trumpet of Conscience, I'm a world citizen, and I speak out on world problems. So I think we have to understand him as a globalist who had a kind of understanding of where we should go from here in terms of the creation of what he called a world house that is inclusive, a world house that is respectful of diversity, a world house that is respectful not only of racial differences, but differences in terms of politics and religion, etc. So I think we have to connect his understanding of spirituality with this idea of the world house, if we're going to understand Dr. King, because he was not simply a Southern black preacher or an American Gandhi. He was a world figure.
Very good. And of course, during this last half minute, let me thank the three of you for giving us that excellent information in reference to Dr. Martin Luther King. And I think it's especially important at this particular time in our history, as the three of you have indicated, to be able to call back in mind an individual as important and as strong as Dr. Martin Luther King. And I want to thank the three of you for bringing us that information. And let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning.